Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 178, Every Man Out of His Humour. Art hath an enemy called ignorance. Last time, Ben Jonson entertained us with a humours comedy that presented a picture of contemporary London through multiple interacting characters. The play was a big success, and Jonson chose to name his next comedy in a very similar way, just substituting in for out. No doubt to capitalise on the success of the earlier play by letting the public know that this was going to be a play in a very similar vein. And although there are no points where the plots or characters cross over during the plays, the humour and satire are very similar. However, there are also some significant differences between the two plays, with the latter offering being more complex structurally and even less reliant on a plot than its predecessor. Every Man Out of His Humour is regarded as less successful than its predecessor, but that doesn't mean that it was a failure. The play was first performed by the Lord Chamberlain's men in 1599, about a year after Every Man in His Humour. In the play, there is a reference to John Marston's Histriomastix, which is known to have been first acted in the autumn of 1599. Jonson may have been aware of the play before it was publicly performed, as it was being prepared, but whatever the case, it places Jonson's play as being written very late in 1599. There are also references to Henry IV Part 2, with a character being referred to as a kinsman of Justice Silence, and the use of the phrase et tu Brute is taken to be a reference to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, as is the line, reason is long since fled to animals, which is thought to paraphrase Shakespeare's, O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts. There's also a record of a performance at court in January 1605, but beyond that it's difficult to gauge exactly how successful the play was with the public. The play was registered with the Stationers' Company in April 1600, and a first quarto was published soon after, with a second printing later that same year. Then a third quarto was also issued that year, this one being by a different bookseller, Nicholas Ling. This was a very poor printing, a very rushed and probably unauthorised edition, which was something Ling made a habit of. 3 years later, he would give Shakespeare's Hamlet pretty much the same treatment. When Jonson reproduced the play in the 1616 folio of his collected works, he included a list of the players who originated the roles. All the leading lights of the Chamberlain's men are there, Burbage, Phillips, Hemmings, Condell and Pope, but not Shakespeare. The inclusion in the folio once again gives us a definitive text, but also the problem of identifying later additions and amendments, and establishing what the performed version of the play really was. This is a very long play, and performing Jonson's full version would be impossible today and perhaps a difficulty even for his contemporaries. The folio also gives us the alternate epilogues for public presentation and for the Queen at Court, and Jonson's own notes on the characters in the play. There is very much the feeling of Jonson wanting to control the interpretation of the play. In fact, this tendency is even evident within the play. Not only do characters within the play comment on the action and the behaviour of other characters, giving us, we assume, Jonson's view of how we should see the action, but there are two characters who sit as part of the audience and comment on the action and the nature of the play. Some of what they say functions as a prologue, and there's an epilogue given by one of the characters, which are all given with the intent of explaining the meaning of action and character, and pointing us to those conclusions that Jonson wants us to draw. And much of that gets just as tedious as that sounds. Here's a synopsis of the action of the play. After the second sounding of the 3 trumpets that announce the start of a play in Elizabethan playhouses, Caudatus, Asper and Mitis enter. Asper, Jonson tells us, is an ingenious and free spirit. Caudatus, a friend of the author who is aware of the gist of the play, and Mitis is, I quote, a person of no action, and therefore we afford him no character. They, well, mostly Asper, talk on subjects relevant to the play before realising that they are being watched by the audience. Asper asks Caudatus and Mitis to take their place and to let their thoughts on the play be known. They discuss Asper and hear the third sounding of the trumpets, at which point the prologue enters, but confesses that he is imperfect in his words, and he asks Cordaitus to speak the prologue. He just about manages this with his scanty knowledge of the play and a cup of wine. The play proper starts. We are some 9 pages into the script already. Michelente is a disillusioned man frustrated by the inequalities that he sees in society. He has sought tranquillity by leaving the city for the countryside. There he is relaxing under a tree when a conversation between Sogliardo, a rich farmer but something of a country bumpkin, and Carlo Buffone, a sardonic cynic, interrupts his thoughts. Sogliardo has chosen Buffone as his role model in the art of becoming a gentleman, but it's pretty clear that his choice is quite questionable. Buffone instructs the eager but naive Sogliardo with a mixture of not-so-subtle put-downs and something close to indifference. All of which makes Michelente quite uncomfortable, especially when he hears the advice that Sogliardo should spend borrowed money to improve his wardrobe, buy servants, and improve his connections. Michelente reveals himself and discovers that the pair are just off to Puntavolo's house. Michelente then overhears Sordidio, a farmer and a miser, consulting his almanac for weather predictions. He resolves to store grain until the predicted poor harvest sends the price up. Even when a farmhand brings him a legal notice ordering him to sell his grain, he resolves to hide it quickly and ignore the order. Outside the home of Puntavolo, Buffone and Sogliardo meet with Sir Fastidious Brisk, a very boastful courtier. After a long discussion about horses, they witness Puntavolo's return from hunting. It is a grand entrance, including a performance where he pretends to be an eccentric old knight who shouts up to his servants and wife, inquiring about the man of the house. He hears and revels in the praise they lavish on Puntavolo. While all this is going on, Sordidio's son Fungoso is admiring Brisk's style, and he asks Sogliardo to trick some money from his father under the guise of needing new law books, so that he can buy fashionable clothes to make him look like Brisk. Reluctantly, Sordidio agrees to lending the money. Having completed his role-playing with his household, Puntavolo announces a bold wager that he has conceived. He bets £5,000 that he, his wife and their dog can travel to Constantinople and return in good health. Buffone sees comedic potential in this venture, while Brisk considers investing £100. Fungoso, who by now is captivated by Brisk's manners and dress sense, is delighted to learn that his brother-in-law, Deliro, is a business associate of Brisk. The next day, Michelente advises Deliro to moderate his excessive devotion to his wife, Falaise. She is never satisfied with his attentions, becoming more and more annoyed with him, even as his gestures of devotion in the form of flowers and perfuming the house become more and more extreme. Fungoso arrives in his newly acquired clothes and borrows money from Falaise to complete his look. But just then, Brisk arrives in a new suit, prompting Fungoso to ask his father for more money to update his wardrobe. Brisk boasts of his popularity at court and his conquest of various court ladies, all stories which his audience are sceptical about. Plans to mortgage his land with Deliro are discussed while Falaise is strongly attracted to Brisk and his talk of courtly sophistication. She retires to her bedroom to think further on his fine attributes. Meeting at St. Paul's Walk, Buffone, with Puntavolo in tow, are looking out for servants for the newly arrived Sogliardo, who is showing off his new coat of arms, which everyone else sees is pretty ridiculous. They make a selection of some dodgy-sounding retainers from a public notice board. Puntavolo explains that his wife has withdrawn from the trip to Constantinople because she is out of her humour, and announces that a cat will replace her. Brisk offers to take Michelente to court if he dresses properly for the occasion, not realising that Michelente has resolved to expose his true reputation once there. Fungoso, still obsessed with fashion, closely examines Brisk's latest attire with the assistance of his tailor, who he has brought along for the purpose. Sogliardo, eager to display how refined he is, hires the boastful but unreliable Shift to help him. Inexplicably, good weather has ruined all of Sordidio's plans as the grain market is flooded with produce and the price has crashed. In despair, he attempts to hang himself, but is saved by his neighbours. This failure and their attitude towards him convince Sordidio of the wrongs he has done, and he resolves to become a more benevolent person. The freshly attired Brisk and Macalente are at court, where Macalente sees all of Brisk's superficialities for what they are. He is particularly amused as the Lady Saviolina scolds Brisk for his smoking habit, which is excessive. Meanwhile, Falaise, who is still enamoured with Brisk, ignores her husband's attempts to please her with music. When Macalente exposes Brisk's foolishness, Deliro decides to foreclose on Brisk, but is stopped by Falaise's entreaties. In the meantime, Fungoso is hard at work as a go-between to earn more money to buy more clothes. Puntavolo and a notary write some stringent conditions into the agreement for the wager as they wait for Brisk to invest in his venture, but he delays the meeting. Deliro decides not to foreclose and disavows Macalente for his marital advice. Sogliardo continues to believe in Swift, while Brisk finally arrives at the notary with Fungoso in hot pursuit. Puntavolo prepares for his journey, which he is now undertaking with only his dog and cat for company. Sogliardo decides to become a courtier based on advice from Buffone and Brisk, little realising that they are simply mocking him. Fungoso despairs as when he finally catches up with Brisk, he sees he is in yet another new suit. At the palace, Puntavolo leaves his dog with a very surly groom, but while he is distracted, Macalente poisons the animal. Brisk and Puntavolo present Sogliardo to Saviolina, claiming that his appearance as a rustic fool is just an affectation. Saviolina thinks that she can see the hidden nobility in him, but quickly realises that she has been deceived. Puntavolo accuses Shift of selling his dog. The confrontation results in Shift admitting that he is a coward by nature, a revelation that disappoints Sogliardo. At the Mitre Tavern, Buffone laments the follies of court life and mocks Puntavolo about his inevitable losses. Buffone engages in a drinking game before an angered Puntavolo seals his mouth up with wax. The watch arrives at the tavern and the group disperse, but Brisk is apprehended and Fungoso is forced to pay for the food and drink consumed. Macalente sees a chance to cure Delirio and Falaise's obsessions. He sends Delirio to settle the tavern bill and Falaise to comfort Brisk in jail. Deliro, by trying to pay that tavern bill, makes Fungoso realise how pointless his quest for fashion is. He then goes to free Brisk, believing that it might mend his marriage. At the jail, Deliro sees Falaise's infatuation with Brisk, just as Brisk is instructed to repay all of his debts. Each character then realises just how blinkered they had been and are cured of their foolish pursuits. Macalente closes the play with a short epilogue. Once again, we have a Jonson play that uses a very thin plot to bring together characters that are governed by dominant humour, and show and tell us about their beliefs and opinions as they crisscross each other in a large group. It is very much as we saw in Every Man in His Humour, but taken to another level. The plot is even thinner, the interacting group of characters even bigger, and the meta-theatrical setup is extended even further. Most of all, Jonson took a firmer control of the play and laboured the points that he wished to make even more thoroughly than in his previous plays. The lengthy introductory action to the play, featuring Caudatus and Mitis as two visitors to the theatre, provide a frame that allows Jonson to comment on his own work. Mitis is a critic of everything about the play, while Caudatus is, in most cases, its supporter, carefully and quite painfully explaining to Mitis why some of the action or the style of the play or the characters' beliefs are justified, even essential. Here's an example of their commentary, which continues at points throughout the play. "Well, I doubt this last scene will endure some grievous torture." "How? You fear 'twill be racked by some hard construction?" "Do you not?" "No, in good faith, unless mine eyes could light me beyond sense. I see no reason why this should be more liable to the rack than the rest. You say, perhaps, the city will not take it well that the merchant is made here to dote so perfectly upon his wife, and she again to be so fastidiously affected as she is." "You have uttered my thought, sir, indeed." "Why, by that portion, the court might as well take offence as him, as well as the courtier, and with much more pretext by how much the palace transcends and goes before in dignity and virtue. But can you imagine that any noble or true spirit in court, whose sinewy and altogether unaffected graces very worthily express him a courtier, will make an exception at the opening of such an empty trunk as this brisk is, or think his own worth impeached by beholding his motley inside? No, sir, I do not." The play proper opens with Michelente listening to a conversation that raises his ire. In fact, this is the role that he fulfills throughout the play. His humour is that of the malcontent. Whatever he hears or sees, it seems that he is determined to take the opposite view, and allow himself to become annoyed by what he sees in others, even when that contradicts an earlier stance he has taken. The disposition of the malcontent reveals itself as envy of his contemporaries, especially those in the court circle who he identifies as frivolous and excessive in their behaviour. His envy drives him to small, spiteful actions against the worst offenders, actions which do, eventually, lead to their humiliation, at which point Michelente finds himself cured of his envious thoughts. Carlo Buffone is one of the most enjoyable characters in the play. He is incapable of reading the room and keeping his thoughts to himself. As Jonson describes him in his character notes that accompany the play, he is a public, scurrilous and profane jester, the more swift than Circe, with absurd smiles will transform any person into deformity. A good feast hound or banquet beagle that will scent you out a supper some 3 miles off and swear to his patrons, damn him, he comes in oars when he was but wafted over on a sculler. A slave that hath an extraordinary gift in pleasing his palate and will swill up more sack at a sitting than would make all of the guard a posset. His religion is railing, his discourse ribaldry. So borrowing from the Roman clever slave who is always first concerned about his belly. In a scene at the Mitre Tavern, Buffone indulges in what is best described as a solo drinking competition. Left alone, he considers what he knows about the various plans and plots that are afoot, saying, "I never hungered so much for anything in my life as I do to know our gallant's success at court. Now is that lean, bald-ribbed Michelente, that salt villain, plotting some mischievous device, and lies a-soaking in their frothy humours like a dry crust, till he has drunk 'em all up. Could the pumice but hold his eyes up at other men's happiness, in any reasonable proportion slid, the slave were to be loved next heaven above honour, wealth, rich fare, apparel, wretches, all the delights of the belly and the groin, whatever." He takes 2 cups of wine and drinks from each alternately some 20 or so swigs, toasting himself until the wine begins to take effect, and he overturns wine, pots, cups and all, as the stage directions say. This reads like a sketch within a play, and perhaps it was a piece written for a particular player who had a speciality for performing drinking games on stage and drunkenness. Apart from the comedy, there is no other obvious reason for the scene. Sogliardo is Buffone's foil, or perhaps stooge is more accurate. His all-consuming desire is for social mobility, a hot topic in Elizabethan society. He engages Buffone for lessons in gentlemanly conduct, but cannot help but display his lack of sophistication. Buffone is openly contemptuous of his erstwhile pupil, who is one of the more sympathetic characters in the play. The duo of the wealthy Delerio and his wife Falaise are an ill-matched couple thanks to their opposing humours. Delerio is overtly devoted to his wife, constantly showering her with gifts and doting over her in an excess of affection. He arranges for their house to be filled with flowers and for every room perfumed as a sign of his devotion. But Falaise can only complain about the oppressive smell and see his actions as overbearing. As she insults him, she turns her intentions to fastidious Brisk, enamoured by his apparent charms. Her infatuation marks her out as suffering from a lack of discretion and foresight. After all, pretty much everybody else manages to see through Brisk's storytelling. Both suffer a hard lesson by the end of the play, as her behaviour ultimately means that her husband loses his love and his trust in her. The aforementioned fastidious Brisk is affectatious in the extreme. Through his behaviour and advice to Fungoso, we soon learn that he is faking it in a big way, relying on his ever-changing wardrobe and tall tales to curry favour with others and keep his purse full through their gullibility. His ever-changing wardrobe is one of the best running jokes of the play, and would presumably have become more and more extreme as the play progressed. He is an example of affected humour, where everything is done for its outward show and impact on others. A hugely comic figure, we struggle to find anything genuine about Brisk, and his imprisonment for debt at the end of the play is a very justified punishment. And where Brisk enters, Fungoso soon follows. His humour is perpetual foolishness, as he attempts to follow Brisk's ever-changing fashions. Part of the Brisk running joke, he is forever one step behind the trendsetter, and his schemes to get the money needed to fund his foolishness become ever more desperate. Although he plays only a small part in the play, the miserly farmer Sordidio is a striking addition to this collection of characters. His grain hoarding speaks to a common problem of the time, as farmers and suppliers often tried to withhold grain as they waited for the price to rise on the prospect of a bad harvest. His avid consultation of the farmer's almanac is amusing and, we quickly realise, doomed to failure. That failure results in his attempted suicide, an on-stage hanging, where he uses a halter as a noose. After his neighbours save him by cutting the rope, his response is to chastise them for ruining a good rope rather than just untying it. "You threadbare, horse-bread-eating rascals! If you would needs have been meddling, could you not have untied it, but you must cut it? And in the midst too, oh me!" His neighbours, quite understandably, begin to wish that they hadn't bothered, but their curses bring him round to a swift realisation of the error of his ways. And that is all that we hear of Sordidio. His scenes amount to a mini-morality play, but have no other relationship to the plot or to the other characters apart from, perhaps, offering a contrast to the flamboyant extravagance of some. Perhaps it was another set piece for a particular actor, but it is a strange addition to this comedy. Puntarvolo is perhaps the most striking character in the play. His penchant for role-playing with his wife and staff as he casts himself as a romantic knight from a bygone era gives some of the best laughs. His wager over his continental travels is equally bizarre. He offers odds at 5-1 on his safe return for himself and his wife and his dog from Constantinople to earn some money. Perhaps it's no surprise that his wife ducks out before the start of the trip, and he finds a suitable replacement for her in his cat. And I should point out here that the stage directions make it quite clear that the dog is present on the stage several times, including when Macalente poisons it. His reasons for doing this, other than disrupting Puntarvolo's plans, are not very clear. Although the presence of the dog has some relevance to the plot, it again feels like Jonson is writing in that plot strand because a performing dog was available and needed to be used. Following the scene, where the death of the dog is discovered, There is a somewhat gruesome discussion of how a live dog might have the skin of the dead one fitted to it to fool Pontivolo of his beloved canine's continued existence. It's all a bit off for modern sensibilities. For balance, the cat who replaces Pontivolo's wife for the planned journey is also listed in the cast, but in this case, a real cat is not strictly required. Once again, Jonson's characters are heading for the extreme end of reality, but their speech patterns are close to those of everyday life. Mostly in prose, the play makes no attempt to replicate the more ornate stylings of other playwrights of the time, except where it is used for satiric purposes. The frequent Latin phrases are, more often than not, used to show the pomposity of the characters. And also, repeating a technique from his previous plays, the characters talk across each other a lot. Each is isolated in the world of their own humours and fixated by their own obsessions. This patchwork of characters is even larger than in Every Man in His Humour, and Jonson is again expecting us to see them as a whole rather than picking on individuals. Jonson's skill at developing consistent and coherent individual characters as part of a collective that is bigger than the sum of its parts can be seen here. The advancement of his technique and skill, since the case is altered, is obvious and considerable. But a problem remains, and that is the overbearing presence of Jonson himself. The play is, unusually for Jonson, not set in London but in Italy, with the opening scenes in the countryside before moving to the city and the court. The residents in the countryside are charmingly rustic and living simple lives, but are enticed by the tales of sophistication that the city dwellers bring with them. The promise of social elevation draws them to the city, but they don't realise that in fact the city is just a place of pretence and affectation, and their hopes of transforming their fortunes are flawed. It is through placing these two sets of characters in the city and the court environment that Jonson exposes the hypocrisy of the central characters. The country folk are exposed for what they are, just as the city types are condemned for their own failings. For a comedy, Jonson is once again giving us a rather bleak assessment of human nature. Interestingly, it is at court that a figure of true discernment is presented. Lady Saviolina effortlessly identifies the impostors from the true nobility. Her astute observations and pithy rebukes highlight the folly of those who dare to masquerade as nobility without understanding the genuine qualities it demands. Perhaps this is Jonson with an eye to court preferment, making sure that those who hold power are shown as the correct and justified arbiters of right and wrong. For some commentators, Every Man Out of His Humour marks the beginning of a run of plays where, however admirable his talents, Jonson's arrogance and self-righteousness cannot be avoided. Any criticism or satire of his own work didn't go unnoticed, and this play is the one where he joined what has become known as the War of the Theatres. Originally christened Poetomachia by Thomas Dekker, Jonson seems to have joined in happily with jibes at Marston, Dekker and others, while also including those references to Shakespeare. He was not just responding to unfriendly comments in his work, but on the theatre of his time in general. Jonson was clearly a close observer of other playwrights and their work, and in many cases thought himself their better. This may be one reason why the focus on plot in Every Man Out of His Humour is so slight. I think I quoted this line from Ian Donaldson's excellent biography of Jonson before, but it's worth repeating as it sums it up so perfectly. As a satirical picture of the manners of the time, proceeding by means of a vivid caricature, couched in witty and brilliant dialogue, and sustained by the righteous indignation which must lie at the heart of all true satire, as a realisation, in short, of the classical ideal of comedy, there has been nothing like Jonson's comedy since the days of Aristophanes. The play includes satire that is levelled at the abuses and corruptions that the playwright saw in everyday life, and as such it is a critique of society in general. Then there is a very much more specific satire levelled at individuals, the poets, the playwrights and others that Jonson knew, his contemporaries. Just as Aristophanes satires Socrates and Euripides, Jonson sets about his fellow poets. but with such a sure footing and with a certainty that becomes arrogance, so that even today it's difficult to miss the sharp satire of literary pretensions and the hope for literary immortality. Jonson was himself hoping for both of those things, but, of course, in his view, he deserved them. The first salvo in the War of the Poets has never been properly identified, but the best guess is that it came from John Marston, when he made satirical reference to Jonson in his play The Scourge of Villainy. Unless, that is, it was started by Jonson himself. In at least 3 of his epigrams, he refers to a playwright, almost certainly Marston, with accusations of plagiarism, cowardice and scurrility. It has not been possible to date the epigrams with certainty. Jonson himself blamed Marston for starting the feud when he told Drummond about the incident years later, claiming that Marston had represented him on stage. That reference is vague, but is taken to mean Marston's 1598 revision of the play Histriomastix, which features a poet, satirist and translator. Apart from that character's contempt for the common people, it's a rather kind portrait, and only gently satiric. But apparently Jonson was thin-skinned and took offence. In Every Man Out of His Humour, Buffone, described in the play as a public, scurrilous and profane jester, is thought to be Jonson's satiric take on Marston. However, because of one very specific event in the play, another suggestion has been made. Charles Chester was a courtier who appears in Aubrey's Brief Lives as a bold, impertinent fellow, a perpetual talker, and made a noise like a drum in a room. So one time, at a tavern, Sir Walter Raleigh beats him and seals up his mouth, that is, his upper and nether beard, with hard wax. Otherwise, Jonson's attacks on Anthony Munday and Masque author Samuel Daniel are undisputed, and may have been driven by some jealousy on Jonson's part, as they both held positions in the establishment that he was aiming at, and both are likely targets in this play. Daniel represented in Fastidious Brisk, and Munday in Pontovolo. During the 17th century, the play was revived several times, but soon faded from the repertoire and became regarded as unperformable without some cutting, which is a view that is largely retained today. I could only find reference to one relatively recent performance, that as part of a conference at the University of Toronto in 2006. Perhaps these days its only hope is for Richard Bean to get hold of it and adapt it, and if you've seen his treatment of Gondoli in One Man, Two Governors, or of Sheridan in Jack Absolute Flies Again, then you know what I mean. The reasons for why this play did not do so well as its predecessor are not recorded contemporaneously, and the question is obscured by the question of how much of what we have in the script was actually performed on stage. But we can make some suggestions. Firstly, it is a comedy, and any comedy that features an attempted suicide, and perhaps even more significantly, the killing of a dog, is on dodgy ground. I know life was tougher then, and people were closer to the brutalities of everyday life, but I still think that these are two significant problems, especially the dog. We also have a play with little plot and a lot of characters. There are funny jokes running through the play and characters to be laughed at, but none that we can really like or see as human beings that we can empathise with. But most of all for me, it is the spectre of Jonson and his preaching that puts me off, and I wonder if that might have annoyed audiences enough to put them off the play too. The word of mouth on this one might have been, "It's very long, and he does go on. For a moment, I thought I was back in church." Next time, it's a very welcome return for Kay Daly, as we discuss Ben Jonson's approach to theatre and his worldview. And then we will return to Shakespeare with one of his best-loved comedies. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon. Or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.